office of the Minister for Finance should be carried along, or the central bank, I mean the governor, could just go on to do all of these things using his discretion, or are there provisions that talks about the powers of the office of Mr. President? These are legal issues that we want to consider today, and we are going to be looking exhaustively. We're going to be considering this conversation. We're going to be looking at it from the CBN Act 2007, just in case you don't have that law. We recommend that you lay your hands on that law and then see how you can also use the knowledge of what is contained in that law to have a better understanding of how things are done and how policies are made as well. So we hope that this conversation today would inspire you to lay your hands on that law. And just in case, if based on today's conversation you are inspired enough to want a copy of that law, please feel free to reach out to us and let us know. You can just send a chat right in the comment box that you would love to have a copy of that law, and then we will send it to you. Remember to share your email address, and just in case you do not want to share it in that public space, just reach out to us. You have our phone numbers across the media space, so just reach out to us and we will be very happy to share the law with you. So talking about the CBN Act 2007, that law talks about, it establishes the Central Bank of Nigeria and then explains the scope of the power of that agency, the powers, the authorities, and every other thing that has to do with the operations, the management of the Central Bank of Nigeria. That law guides everything, including whether it's the overseeing power on other, on commercial banks, many other roles. You find everything stated in that CBN Act of 2007. And to that burning conversation, which is what we are here to address today, legal tender. When you hear the word legal tender, it could mean the different denomination of our currency. So 200 naira note, 500 naira note, 1000 naira note, these are legal tenders, and these are the denominations precisely that the CBN has rolled out announcements as wanting to redesign. So interestingly, this same law, precisely section 2B of that law, gives the Central Bank of Nigeria the power to create, or better still, to issue legal tender. So that is the foundation, of what we are discussing today. And then the question would then be, if we can jump on that. Now we've established that the Central Bank of Nigeria has the power to issue legal tender. The question is what's the process for issuing legal tender? And then is the office of the Honorable Minister for Finance supposed to be involved in this process? Let's take a deep dive a little into the composition of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Under section 6, precisely section 6 sub 2c of that law, it talks about, now section 6 sub 2 talks about the composition of the board of directors of the Central Bank of Nigeria. And under that section 6 sub 2c, there is also, you'll find that there is a representative from the office of the Minister for Finance, which is the permanent secretary of the Federal Ministry of Finance, is supposed to be, or better still, is a member of the board of CBN. And then the question would then be, what are the roles of this board? Because the law, as said earlier on, governs everything around the operation of CBN. So what are the roles of this board? Does the role also capture the need for Mr. Governor, which is the governor of the CBN, and his administrative cohorts, the executive, the day-to-day people? Does that provision, or does the law mandate them to consult or to present for approval before the CBN board the issue of redesigning the Naira? Interestingly, you'll find that in that same law, Section 7, Sub 2 of CBN Act narrows down the scope of power, or the scope, better still, of the operation of the board to operational activities. And the question would then be, when it comes to redesigning the Naira, this of course will not be considered as an operational activity, which in essence would then mean that not being an administrative matter, which is the word that was used, administrative matters. So not being an administrative matter, we cannot say that the CBN governor respectively respectfully has the duty to consult or to seek the approval of the CBN board before taking this step. So what should have been done? Well, we're coming to that in this conversation. But just before we get to that point, let's also look at another angle to this conversation. Let's look at the conversation around, are there power checks that also regulates the office of Mr. Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria? Yes, from the CBN Act, there are power checks. Power checks would mean, are there things, or are there conditions to be fulfilled on certain? Are there people, are there institutions that the central bank, or especially the governor, is liable, is responsible to before taking certain steps? Well, so the first power check has to do with the National Assembly. The CBN governor has a duty to continue to even the external reserve and all of these things. These are some of the things that the CBN governor has a duty to update the National Assembly about. But interestingly, it does not mean that the National Assembly can overrule the decision of the Central Bank of Nigeria, especially around all of these topical issues that we have talked about. So it would then mean that the function really is more of an accountability function, where the National Assembly and its membership are properly carried along on the financial, the monetary policies and policies around currency, external reserve, and all of those things. These are things that of course are this is the way by which the CBN, especially the governor, is responsible or is accountable to the National Assembly. Now we come to the second leg, which is the accountability to the office of Mr. President. There are certain instances where the CBN governor is accountable on topical issues to the office of Mr. President. In essence, the accountability in this situation would mean that the CBN governor and the CBN as a whole, they have a duty to seek for approval of Mr. President on certain topical issues. And the question before us is the issue of the redesign of legal tender, of some of our legal tenders. Is it one of those subjects to which the CBN must seek an approval before it can take on such a task? Now, this is where we come to, and the very interesting point is that yes, this is one of the instances where the CBN governor must seek an approval. Remember, we said earlier on about section 2B of the CBN Act, which has to do with the power of the CBN to issue tender, legal tender. Now, when beyond that, you'd agree with me that beyond issuing tender, sometimes there will be a need to redesign some of these legal tenders, or to even introduce new legal tender, or to do any other thing, anything that affects the legal tender. which is where the office of the Mr. President comes in. So section 2B, we have section 17, we have section 18. These are provisions that we need you to check. These are provisions that really talks about the powers of Mr. President. So there is a legal tender, which is section 2B. If you check section 17, section 18, you'll see conversation around printing, around issuing, around re-issuing, even around change of currency. These are things that the Central Bank of Nigeria has the power over. And you might then agree with me that yes, first, the central bank, the governor of the CBN was right in making a call that by December 15, new notes will be rolled out that would take the place of the notes that we know as of now. So new notes for 200 Naira, for 500 Naira, for 1,000 Naira, and that by January the new notes would then become the legal tender. Section 20 sub 3 of the CBN'S Act then talks about the need to seek the section 17 and 18, the need to seek the approval of Mr. President. Now section 20, which is also very key, is now the one that talks about the fact that the CBN governor should have sought the directive and the approval of Mr. President and then give a reasonable notice to members of the public. The question again is whether this timeline that we have, whether the deadline of January 31, 2023 is a reasonable notice. Well, so I beg to say that we leave this to our listeners. What do you think about the timeline, the time frame? Do you think it's reasonable? Do you think it's sufficient? Just in case you want to ask me, I'm going to say that, well, the test of reasonability is the test of a bystander. What do we mean by bystander? If you put a neutral person on the spot, a neutral person that is not affected by political, economic, or some other factors, and then you ask that, look, this decision is to be made and is to be come to effect on so day. Do you think that this is a reasonable notice? So it's the test of a bystander, a reasonable person. What will a reasonable person say? Will a reasonable person say this is a reasonable notice, or this period is actually a reasonable period, and all of that? Well, so it's been said again across different media platforms, especially online, that the CBN governor and the CBN itself ought to take cue from best practices, international best. As we said, this is a best practice. No one no one practice can be imposed or superimposed on the CBN, bearing in mind that the CBN is a regulatory agency and it has a law that governs its affairs. So there is no law that says that the CBN must roll out or redesign or renew every 5 to 8 years. So I would just rather say that yes, the CBN is within its rights to determine when and how, depending on the realities, the local realities, and also depending on the best interest of Nigerians, which are the two standards that we should be considering in this conversation, instead of just bogusly focusing on whether the conversation around international best practices, because the reality again of these places where these best practices are brought from may not be the reality of Nigeria as it were, and so we need to create our own reality and then understand whether this suffices and is something that is worth adopting as our own policy. So this is just my own opinion around this, and I believe that it represents the opinion of many people as well. Now, coming to the conversation around presidential approval, we've talked about the fact that the office of Mr. President is also one of those checks and balances that governs the activities of the Central Bank of Nigeria. And here we are talking about legal tender, redesigning, designing, reissuance, and all of that. Interestingly, Section 19 of the CBN'S Act says something around presidential approval. So denomination, fractions, form, design, devices to be printed, all of these are topical issues around what Mr. President must approve before the CBN would have that authority to be able to then roll it out as a policy or as something that they want to implement. So these are interesting things around today's conversation. And just to sum up today's conversation, I want us to quickly look at, are there possible legal implications? Remember, we talked about we're talking about redesigning of the Naira notes, the impacts and the benefits, and we are trying as much as possible to ensure that this is a new but basically around what the law says. But let's look at the legal implication. The first obvious legal implication is that starting from that day, that deadline, what we know today as legal tender will cease to be legal tender. I wish I have examples of these Naira notes that are affected, but you might just have one in your pocket where you are, and I believe that you know these Naira notes that are affected. So they would cease to be legal tenders, meaning if you try to spend it after that period, you might just be things that form the history of our dear nation, Nigeria. I remember my first time visiting Badagry, and I saw shillings, I saw a number of things. It's interesting to see all of these things. And the point therefore is that we are definitely then going to get to a phase where the 200 naira notes, the 500 naira note, the 1000 naira notes, as we know them now, will then become something that is relevant only for the museum, where the children that are coming after us or the people coming after us can look at those designs, can look at those notes and say, wow, so this used to be the notes that are being was spent at some point or within a period of time in our dear nation Nigeria. Now this is very interesting, and I hope you also find it interesting. Thank you for being a part of today's conversation, and I hope that you've been able to gain one or two things. Remember, drop your comments, drop your feedbacks, ask your questions, and we love to hear from you. Once again, my name is Eyitayo Ogunyemi, and I'm privileged to take the lead over today's conversation. Do have for yourself a wonderful, wonderful day, and we wish you the very best.